So please join me in welcoming to the stage Alok Sharma. Alok. Thank you, sir, for being a part of this. I don't really need to introduce you, but you were the president of COP26. So you bring a unique perspective, I think, to this year's proceedings. And of course, especially for the global development community that is Devex, you were the Secretary of State of DFID. So you know both the climate world and the development world intimately. Just at a high level, how do you think COP28 is going thus far? I remember, I'm sure many people here remember that moment, that dramatic moment at the end of COP26 when you were kind of holding back tears. You had worked so hard to drive to an agreement. You know what this process is like. So how do you judge where we are today in COP28?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me here. And thank you for coming on what is supposed to be the rest day. No one is resting here, which is great. Look, I was at an event yesterday where I was asked to give a grade on where we are.
Yeah.
And I made the point that I normally didn't do very well in midterm exams, and that's why I wasn't prepared to give a grade until the end. So we will see what happens at the end. But I think we've had some good progress at the start in terms of the loss and damage fund, the pledges. But just one thing I would say on pledges is that one thing is to pledge, the other is to actually get the money flowing. And we know that there's a statistic that between 2013 and 2021, of all the money pledged by developed nations, only about half of it has actually flowed. So we need to make sure that money flows. We've seen continuation on things like the methane pledge. 150 countries signed up to that. 118 countries so far signed up to tripling renewables. All that is great, some of the finance announcements. But the key issue here for me is going to be finance and energy transition. And there is a reason why so many of us are fighting to ensure that phase out of fossil fuels is in the negotiated language.
Yeah, and do you think this is the year when we get that? I mean, you were fighting for this in COP26. Do you feel like this is the time, even in the UAE, even in a presidency led by someone who runs a major oil company? I mean, do you think it's possible that this is the year?
Well, look, I mean, it took us 21 COPs to get to Paris. I mean, it is slightly mind-boggling. It took us 21 COPs to get to Paris. It took us 26 COPs for the first time to get any kind of language on fossil fuels, that we had phased down rather than phase out of coal. But I can tell you, even up to that morning, that final morning, people were texting me saying, you've had a pretty good go at this coal language, but you're not going to get it in. You do realize. But we did. We pushed and we got language in. So I think in a way, the UAE is in a unique position, given that oil and gas is very much part of their economy, to actually push and encourage others to do more. And frankly, if not now, then when, right? If you're going to cut emissions by over 40% by 2030, we are literally running out of time.
Yeah. I mean, well, you talked about what I call pledge inflation, the challenge of people pledging, and then there's not a lot of accountability for it. And when you think about your own COP presidency, one of the big successes was deforestation, right? You got a big global agreement, and yet last year, 10% of the world's tropical forests were destroyed. So when you think about what comes out of COP in terms of what's announced and pledged and agreed versus what really flows out in the real world, does that make you a bit cynical about the disconnect between here and reality? Or do you think ultimately these things, including deforestation, will work?
Yeah, so actually, there are lots of people out there, I'm sure no one here, but lots of people say, do these COPs actually matter? From my perspective, they absolutely matter because of the political signal they send to other governments, to businesses, to civil society as well. And, COP26 was the first COP where we actually had the business community present. I actually think that was a good thing. And we're seeing, obviously, the business community very much here as well, connecting these very complex set of negotiations with real world efforts as well. So, I mean, one thing I would ask for, though, is that one thing is for governments to make pledges and agree to a negotiated outcome here. The other is, what do you do domestically? Firstly, could we please be consistent in what we say internationally with what we do domestically? Secondly, if you want to see lots more renewables, you need to strengthen your grids. Right? You need to change your planning rules. Right. You need to get incentives in to get people to invest. All of that needs to happen at a domestic level. And we're seeing some of that, but it's just not fast enough.
Speaking of the domestic politics, what about your own government in the UK, the Sunak government? he's been pretty widely criticized. He came here for a brief visit. He talked about really rolling back some of the commitments that had been made for the UK's own commitments to emissions reduction. How do you judge where the Sunak government is on these issues? I know you've talked about this a bit publicly, but how do you feel?
Well, so first thing to say is that I've not been in government for the past year, so I have been able to speak quite freely about these matters. And at the time when the speech that was made in September, I was at the UN General Assembly at the time, I was very public, which is that I was disappointed. I think the rhetoric was unfortunate. In terms of the actual policy changes, yes, they will have an impact. We need to find emission savings elsewhere if you want to keep to your 2030 targets. But I think it's the rhetoric, the message it sent. And I've certainly heard from international partners that they kind of wish the UK was still at the top table, was still pushing. So for
it's
me,
lost its leadership in a sense on this issue.
Well, let's put it like this: our leadership isn't what it was at the time that we were doing COP.
Yeah, and I mean,
I'm trying to be diplomatic.
I can see that. I think, in a sense, what Rishi Sunak was trying to say plays out in many countries around the world. There's this idea that, and it plays out with this issue of fossil fuel phase down versus phase out, that the domestic politics just aren't there in the United States, my own country, and many others. Do you think there is truth to that? Do you think that sort of the politics are on the side of those who say, don't go for phase out, it's too extreme?
Okay, so I think in terms of the politics of this, you're in a democracy, you're working on 3, 4, 5-year cycles. In our case, there's going to be an election within 12 months. So that is what focuses you quite a lot. But actually, if part of the reason you do something is because you think it will have an electoral advantage, I would argue that doesn't really hold, certainly from a UK context. If you look at all the polling out there, it kind of doesn't matter what people's personal politics is. Climate and environment are still number 3, number 4, number 5 in terms of a list of issues that matters most to them. And as you get down the age group, it matters more and more.
So you can see the direction of the trend.
You can
right?
see the direction of the trend. So for me, I think, and actually the other thing that I wish we spoke more about is the economic opportunity here as well, right? Of course, this is about the environment, but there's also a big economic opportunity. And that's why we need to send long-term signals as governments in terms of policy. That's why when there was a rowback from 2030 to 2035, the date by which we would have all new vehicles being zero-emission vehicles in the UK, you saw the auto sector react negatively as well. These guys are investing for the long term. They want to create jobs. They want to invest. But the quid pro quo is you give them long-term policy signals and certainty, and you give them incentives to invest.
That's right. It is, and we'll talk about in a moment why that's such a development topic as well, right? And you know this better than anyone, having led DFID. We have another former DFID colleague with us today. I'd love to pass the floor to her briefly for a provocative question and push to us on stage. If we could bring a microphone. We have Claire Shakya with us today, who is with the Nature Conservancy, where she's the global managing director for tackling climate change. We'd love to hear a question from Claire. Do we have a microphone? Well, it's coming shortly. While we give them a chance to get you a microphone, I'm going to come back to you, if I can quickly, on your relationship and leadership of DFID. You were there in the last year before it merged into FCDO. You know this world very well. We talked about the kind of diminishment of UK leadership on climate. It seems like we've had a similar story on development. When you think about what the opportunity is for FCDO going forward and the importance of the climate issue, do you think climate and development ultimately are sort of merging as issues? Or do you think this is one agenda? Or do you still think there are separate purposes behind these two areas of focus?
No, look, I mean, I think they are very much one agenda. I mean, taking care of climate and taking care of development, I don't think there should be a sort of view that we do one rather than the other. It's two sides of the same coin. So you need to do that. I think on the issue of DFID, since I'm unleashed now, let me give you my views,
please.
Which is that, look, we're not, I don't think we're necessarily going to sort of go back. I think we're in a position where we've had this for a number of years, things are happening. I just wish at the time, and this is what I had certainly advocated, I just wish at the time we had done this somewhat more slowly, to have a sort of integration that took place over a little period of time. And I think one of the things that colleagues who are still in the system will reflect upon is that because it was so sudden, that created its own upheaval. And I'm not sure that necessarily brought out the best in the system. But I have to say that, the DFID colleagues I worked with, the Foreign Office colleagues I worked with, some of the most brilliant and committed and dedicated people in the UK government. And I hope they can continue to make a difference.
Would you think there's still an opportunity to break FCDO apart and make DFID once again an independent agency and department?
Well, look, it takes a lot of energy to break things up, to bring things together. And, we have what we have now. I mean, I can't tell you what will happen in the future. I'm not in government. I'm not privy to those discussions. I think we need to work with what we've got, and we need to make the best of it. And actually, some years later now, when you have a discussion, it is starting to work.
Okay. Well, we've got Claire check in now with a microphone, and you can tell us if we're wrong about that. But we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. So this COP is an important COP for picking up the pace. We are at the time of what's called in the jargon the global stocktake. This sends the signal for the next update of the national commitments, the NDCs. Whether or not, we need to see phase out of fossil fuels, as you've said. We need to see tripling of renewables. We need to see delivery on the promises that have been made already, the 100 billion, and the doubling of adaptation, which was one of your great successes for the poorest countries, where we've actually seen a drop in adaptation finance this year. And we also need to see a change in approach, less of I'm the technical expert coming to solve your problems, and much more of working with those governments on locally led approaches that work for climate, nature, and poverty together. And we need a clear priority, continued clear commitment to the LDCs and small island developing states, all of which is hanging in the balance this COP. So what do you think we can do between now and the moment when that final text is agreed to ensure that we see those signals that we desperately need to pick up the pace?
Well, look, keep pushing your government's representatives, keep telling them why this matters. Some of you will be observers in negotiations. You have a really important role to play. And Claire, I agree with you. All of the above are needed, but I just want to focus on this issue of fossil fuels and energy transition. If you're going to triple, as I hope we will get, a tripling of renewables capacity, by the way, in Africa, it needs to be 6 times the pace, and doubling of energy efficiency and cutting methane and more hydrogen, that's great. But the other side of this has to be dealing with fossil fuels. And we know that 75% of all global emissions are energy related. So if you are not prepared to deal with this issue of fossil fuels, I think there is going to be a gaping hole in what needs to be done. And I know there are people who will tell you that technology will save the day. Well, look, carbon capture storage is emerging technology. It absolutely has a role to play in hard-to-abate sectors, but let's not kid ourselves, right? It is not cheap enough. It is not deployed, enough across the world to make the difference where we will be making a big cut in emissions by 2030, just relying on technology. We have to address the issue of fossil fuel production and usage.
And you're privy, I know you're not the president of this COP, but you're privy to some of these conversations that are happening. Do you feel like the message you're sending now is one we're likely to see happen? This is the title of our session, Will COP28 Deliver? Do you think ultimately it will a few days from now when we know the results?
Look, it has to. It really has to. We are basically out of time. And at the end of COP26, we had the International Energy Agency sort of tot up all the commitments. And they said that if everything was delivered, we were heading towards 1.8 degrees, right? We've seen the latest unit report. We are going to blow through 1.5 unless we take urgent action.
Yep.
And that's not happening. And I get so frustrated because we hear all the right words coming out of the mouths of leaders, but actually, where's the action? Where's the delivery? That's what's missing.
Well, one last question for you. We talked about how the climate and development agendas really are very much united. but I think the climate and development communities are still somewhat different. You know, I meet different people at COP than I might meet at the World Bank spring meetings, let's say. What is your message to the development community that you know so well that might still be working on health or on agriculture in their old ways, in their old silos, given the moment we're in on climate?
Yeah. Well, look, it's not my sort of place to sort of lecture anyone or give sort of unsolicited advice. The only thing I would say to you is that the whole thing is totally interconnected. We know that the impact of climate is making food security, water security, migration issues, security issues, all of that is being exacerbated because of the changing climate. So you have to deal with these two issues together. And please, let's work cooperatively. I mean, the one thing that will solve this, or at least have an impact on it, is governments, business community, but particularly then civil society working together on this. If we can do that, we will deliver. And I've got two daughters. I've got a 24-year-old and a 22-year-old. We talk about this stuff. We talk about this stuff. I wasn't talking about this stuff with my parents, and maybe this doesn't happen in every family. But young people now are absolutely, they really care about this, and it is about their future. And that's why at this COP, we need to get this right.
Well, thank you for starting our day off here at Devex's Climate Plus Summit with that important message. Please join me in thanking Alok Sharma.